and welcome to another Nighter in Conversation. I just wanted to say that I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra. It's a beautiful day, and I hope you're all having beautiful days wherever you are across this continent. I want to acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and it is an incredible privilege to be able to tell stories here. I'm joined today by our guest, Sue Giles AM. She has been the artistic director of Polyglot Theatre since 2000. Polyglot is a Melbourne-based company that has been making work for young people for more than 40 years and has an international reputation for contemporary theatre and live art that create experiences with children that combine theatre, play and visual spectacle. Sue's works have been performed in 15 countries on 5 continents in 5 different languages. They've been presented by Australia's major festivals and some of the world's leading art centres, plus ASSETEJ International Festival and Congress in both Adelaide in 2008 and Warsaw in 2014. Her works have won several awards, including the 2015 Green Room Award for Innovation in Contemporary Performance for Young People and nominated for the Age Critics and Helpman Awards. Sue has spoken about her work and processes around the world and has mentored independent artists in Melbourne, Edinburgh and New York. Sue is an advocate for theatre for young audiences in Australia through a partnership with Theatre Network Australia and internationally as president of ASSETEJ International, the Global Association of Theatre for Young Audiences. In 2018, Sue received the Green Room Lifetime Achievement Award for her work in the Australian arts industry and authored a platform paper for Currency Press titled Young People and the Arts, An Agenda for Change. In 2019, Sue was appointed member of the Order of Australia in the Australia Day 2019 honours list for her significant services to the performing arts as an artistic director and theatre for children. That is an extraordinary list of achievements, and it's such a pleasure to have you here joining us today, Sue.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Tasnim. Thank you very much.
I feel like there were so many things that I want to ask you about. I'm like, did I get the honorary title right? Sue's done so many incredible things. I mean, I did want to ask you though, how are you doing in Melbourne? How are things going? This seems like it's lockdown number infinity. But hopefully now that we have vaccination happening, fingers crossed.
Yeah, there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel, everybody, but it does feel like it's going on forever, doesn't it? We're in Lockheed D number 6, so we are just looking at when we can start to relax the restrictions that we're under at the moment, and so we feel for everybody in Sydney as well. We're lockdown buddies. It does make a huge difference to how you work and how you think and how you regard yourself as an artist. And so I really acknowledge everybody here of what that might be doing to your sense of creativity and identity at this time as well.
Yeah, it is one of those incredibly interesting ways of having to learn how to pivot and oh no, that's one of those other buzzwords. And like adapt your skills that we all learn as theatre makers and performance makers. I feel like the creativity and the, I guess, approach to doing things outside of the box has had to be adapted in so many different ways to be able to fit with our current circumstances.
Absolutely.
So what I was going to ask, actually, because we're talking through the Nighter in Conversation series, I want to ask about your path to working into working in theatre. Were you formally trained? What kind of work were you drawn to? How did you find yourself making work?
Look, through a variety of paths. I did do training. I was at the Drama Studio in Sydney, which doesn't exist anymore. It was the training that came from the Drama Centre in London. So our teachers came through that drama course and then started a course in Sydney. It used to be called the Nimrod Night Classes. Back before Belvoir Street was Nimrod. So that was in 1982. And so before that, I grew up in Adelaide, and so I started doing, I studied drama at Adelaide Uni and then started working, basically. In fact, I missed my own graduation because I was on tour with a children's show at that point. Worked with the fabulous Sue Ryder there and Jim Ville. Sue's gone on to direct all sorts of companies up in Queensland. And so, yeah, kind of a variety of ways from the moment I was 16, really, I started performing. And so I was training as an actor, and then met my partner at drama school, as you do, and we started working together and we made our own company and started creating our own work. And, I mean, I think one of the great things about that course that I did at the drama studio was that it was all about self-determinism. So it was about the creative process and how to be a theatre maker. It involved all aspects of that career. So we came out of that knowing really how to make stuff and how to kind of forge our own careers, which was really useful because not everyone gets an audition. So that kind of, I've never done anything else, basically. I've kind of worked in the arts for 40 years. And after we started our own company, then Ian became artistic director of Back to Back Theatre, and I started working as an independent director and then did a lot of work in that space, started working with all sorts of different art forms, did a lot of writing, and then ended up with Polyglot in the year 2000, and which was then a puppetry company, and I'd started to direct puppetry a few years before, did lots of work with Terrapin and with independent puppetry artists, and yes, they ended up as artistic director of this puppetry company, which I immediately changed and turned into something else. So it's been quite a gift, actually. My career went through the kind of stages where funding was still available, where there was a lot of community arts, there was a lot of art in working life was very strong. There were a lot more different branches to what you could do, and a lot more support for arts in the general community, and in schools as well. Enormous amount of support for arts in schools, and so the landscape's very different now.
It is one of those interesting things because I often will hear about, the various streams of funding at the council, at the Australia Council, for arts in communities and multicultural arts, and I've heard all these stories from certainly from before I was a practitioner about the things that were possible. Is that kind of around the time that you became interested in theatre for young audiences, or was it with your appointment at Polyglot?
No, I've always been involved. I think from 1977 was the beginning of the Come Out Festival in Adelaide, which was the first ever children's arts festival in Australia, and my father was one of the co-founders of that. So I've always kind of been embedded and immersed in it. And the first job I had out of university was with the children's theatre company that Sue Ryder directed. And then when I first graduated from my drama school, I went into Tow Truck Theatre, which was a school touring company there as well. So I've always been involved in it. And I just kind of I love the form because it's incredibly diverse. So there's a lot of scope, and it's an incredibly challenging audience, and the ways that you can express ideas and the sort of methods that you need to use to express ideas in that form are really challenging. And so it's always been a field that has intense interest for me. So yeah, when Polyglot came, it's kind of like a massive gift, whereas then I could just really kind of explore my own interest in that form and where it could take me.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I wanted to ask, before we kind of delve into the work of Polyglot, about theatre for young audiences, because I think people think of a lot of different things when we talk about that. we could be speaking to a lot of students now who, like me, would have come through youth theatre. There's a lot of, theatre in education. How do these, what are these different forms, and how do, I guess, they work with each other as well, since they are slightly different?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And I think this central kind of question of perception of children's theatre is something that that is very conservative in Australia. I think the expectations that people have around the form are very conservative as well. And often people kind of latch on to things like, like the Wiggles or like Angelina Ballerina or, some of those big commercial touring productions, but they forget the kind of the variety that's available out there. And unfortunately, our sector is quite small and is getting smaller. Certainly the funded part of it is getting smaller. But the diversity of the work is getting bigger. And I love it that you mentioned youth arts, because that's like a really strong form in Australia. There's a lot of youth arts companies, and a lot of young people find themselves and find the kind of strength and resilience that they need, especially in remote communities and in regional areas. They find that resilience, strength and identity through those companies. And so they serve an incredibly strong purpose. Also, they serve as a pathway into the arts as well, and really kind of enabling those young people to feel that they are cultural citizens, that they have a right to arts and culture, and therefore they will be the confident arts consumers in the future as well. But this idea that art needs to be created for any age and all ages is a really, really interesting point, because often as adults we think that people aren't really people until they're adults. And there's still a lot of perception out there that why make work for babies? Why make work for little children that's actually got some thought and some concept behind it, because they won't get it anyway and they'll just laugh at the fart jokes. And so there's a really kind of, a very simplified version of thinking when it comes to children's theatre. And that's what we kind of fight against as practitioners, all of us. And we're a very collegiate sector, like we all talk. So that's one of the big struggles we have, is about that central issue of value and valuing that audience in all its diversity.
Absolutely. I think it's something that's so interesting and important. In another life, I worked in child rights. And so, like, hearing theatre makers talk about the cultural and artistic rights of a child, I think is very exciting. Speaking of, you have written, and you just spoke about children as cultural citizens, as people with those rights, just as adults have them. What do we get wrong and what do we get right about that? I think, in this country, but also globally, since, your practice has taken you all over as well.
The difficulty that people have in thinking of children of cultural citizens is that children are powerless in society. They don't have a voice. They don't have money. They're not seen as people who do make decisions for themselves. They are guided and directed by the adults around them. And so fighting for other people's rights is a really essential part of what it is to be a human, not just your own. When you're faced with a group of society who can't talk for themselves or don't know how to talk for themselves, then it's the responsibility of the rest of society to stand up and say, hang on, those people don't have a voice, is what we talk about when we're talking about any sorts of access or inclusive practice, is that we forget that the younger of us are also need to be fought for. So it's just, I feel it's the responsibility of everybody to recognise that they once were a child. And so you can't just forget that part of the world. That's 4.7 million young Australians under the age of 15 in this country. And yet the amount of work or the amount of access to art and culture that they have is really, really a lot smaller than the adults around them. Yeah.
And in terms of, I guess, Australian theatre for young audiences? How does it compare to theatre for young audiences internationally?
Look, it's so interesting being part of a global association because you can see the cultural impact really clearly. The kind of work that's created in Australia, in a lot of ways, I would say that what we have a country where we often work outside, where we work a lot in community, where youth arts is incredibly strong, as I've said. So we're used to being participants. There's actually a really growing strand of participatory work at the moment. And in a way, it's funny because I grew up in the 70s, to hark back to that time, and actually participation was pretty massive then too. Might go in cycles. At the moment, we're in a cycle of increased participation, which is kind of it's kind of ironic because we're going through this incredible lockdown and restrictions and pandemic, and everyone's going but that's actually made everybody who's working in participation at the moment, and we did get together during the last lockdown and actually talk about the challenge to our particular sorts of work. The idea of people getting together in shared space, sharing touch, sharing ideas, being immersed in a work, is more important than ever, we're feeling. So, but that takes it away. So we've got a strong participatory art form base. We have an incredibly isolated base of regional theatres around the nation. Like, they're very, very distant from each other. We work with great distance. We work with small populations. And the difference that makes means that often the people who are making work for children need to, or feel they need to, follow a commercial imperative or a kind of an economic imperative. So I feel that in the Australian scene, the exploration is happening much more from an independent theatre level, and that and that's not often seen. So I feel that there's a kind of an undercover of really great exploration, and certainly the companies that are really standing out in our country are doing, really beautiful, high quality, fantastic work, and usually original work too, which is really wonderful. Very different to in Europe. There's a lot more of a kind of classical base of stories. In places like I find South Korea fascinating because their relationship between parents and children in that country is very different to what it is here. So that the work that they create has a really different purpose. They like to keep the children safe and happy, and so the work has a real kind of angle towards that as an end game. The kind of the classic example in Germany is that people are not scared of the depressing ending. They're not scared of unhappy endings, so that they can create work that's about death and loss and all the play things that some other countries just won't go near. So, and we have these big conversations globally about what quality is, what deep conceptual work is, what's strong, what the audience needs, and that changes so dramatically around the world depending on what people are coping with as well. And this is why the children's audience is so fascinating, because the adults around them can be intensely protective, can be intensely engaged in their well-being and their resilience. They can be just wanting to give them fun and release because their lives are so terrible. So there's so many different reasons that the adults are thinking about what that audience needs. It's kind of fascinating because I don't think there's another art form that thinks about their audience to such detail as the people in theatre for young audiences do.
It's so true. As you were just saying that, I was like, sure, theatre makers for adult audiences. We think about audiences, but not anywhere near that extent.
No, when you're thinking about the difference between a child who is 18 months old and a child who's 5, and then the difference of the work that you're going to create for the reception of that person, That's an extraordinary difference, and it's not the difference you'll find between a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old. That difference is not so big. It still exists, but it's not so big.
Sure. I wanted to ask you actually about the work that you make. I have some examples that I want to talk about later, but just generally, I wanted to ask you about what the starting point is for a creation of a work. Polyglot does a lot of collaborative work. Does it come from a collaboration? Does it come from a seed of an idea? Does it come from like a commission? What is the starting point for the work that's made?
It varies. Like all the companies that I know, like there's sometimes it's an artistic idea that springs out of your head, and then that becomes the central kind of push. Or for us, our whole premise is about involving children from the very beginning. So the idea, like our vision, is of a world where children are powerful, artistically, socially, and culturally. And so when we take that really seriously, we're placing kids at the front of creation and central to creation, and also central as participants in the creative act. So when we have three basic forms of work, one of them is a big play spaces that can come into public spaces that are often free, that are non-verbal, that are very physical and hands-on. You're making things, you're immersed in an environment. And for those, we look at children's play, what they play with, how they play, observing the child at play. A few of our famous works I've just picked on my own children, watching them play with things in the backyard, and then going, well, that'd be pretty interesting if we manifold, like made it 1,000 cardboard boxes instead of, one. And so works get born in that way. You just go, what would happen if? And then getting the kids to be participants in that work, then the work starts to evolve. So for us, a lot of our participatory work in public space is evolutionary work. It just constantly changes depending on who's reacting with it. And again, if you take it to other countries in the world, people react and build completely differently. So it's kind of fascinating. So we've got about 7 of those sorts of works. And then we make theatre that comes from children's process for kids, where story comes out, where narrative comes out. And one of our most recent works is a collaboration with Paper Moon Puppet Theatre in Indonesia. And we've had a relationship for over 10, nearly 12 years now. And that work was created partly from a community in North Java and partly from a school in West Braybrook, which had a large refugee and newly arrived population of children. And that became a refugee story set in a boat. And so the story of the child and the community that we worked with in North Java, those two experiences melded to become the one work. And I think certainly for my work, collaboration is the only way to go. I'm often, all the theatre work that I make is usually co-directed. And I love that exchange, and that immersion in somebody else's experience is an incredibly important part of it. And the third sort of work that we do is based completely on children's worldview, where we respond to their situation in community and then create through multiple art forms, works of art that come from that worldview, and usually art that's at service for the service to the community, like functional art. And I love that idea as well, that art has to have a purpose in some places before it can be accepted.
I mean, fair enough. It's one of those things where, I mean, last time I was talking to someone about the purpose of art, and it all got very philosophical. You spoke about,
well, that's right. It's a big question.
It very much is. It very much is. And I feel like, not having answers is maybe the most comfortable place to be in.
Well, that's right. But, Tasnim, we're in a situation in our country where we are having to fight for the value of the arts generally, not just in theatre for young audiences.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a frightening place when we have to find economic and societal reasons for why art should exist. And we know the benefits that we offer as artists, and the benefits that happen within society. But why we should be just marginalised to that reason for existing is a failure of imagination on behalf of Australia. Although the research shows that Australians don't think that way. They think art is essential. It's just our politicians who are doing it.
Oh, it's so frustrating. It is one of those things where, quantifying things that feel intrinsic feels really, it can be a frustrating process.
But there also is no shame in being able to articulate it.
Yeah.
Because, there is, especially in a country like ours, and, then they have the same problem in America as well, where the arts really has to battle for identity. And there's no shame in being able to articulate all those great reasons and to be able to fight for your right to be an artist. It's becoming more and more essential, however, which is sad.
It is.
But there's no shame in it.
It's something that I've really admired about a lot of artists based in Melbourne, like around things like vaccination and was it Art Centre Melbourne who organised the whole kind of who's who of artists from around Melbourne to talk about the impact of the lockdowns in like this beautiful video. I need to find it. But yeah, I just think the way that we mobilise is pretty extraordinary. I did want to ask you about the process of collaboration. You're saying a lot of the work you make is co-directed. What is the process for you for working with design as well, like sound and set and lighting? Because obviously all of this is so important. And potentially, if you wanted to, we could also talk about How High the Sky, because I just find it a fascinating piece of work as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, look, when we start our processes, we start with everybody in the room. I think design and sound are an essential part of that whole development process, as well as the kids are there as well. So not like often, when it gives you a funny impression, doesn't it? We make particular times with children because having people in the room, they're not performers, they are co-creators in a lot of ways. So and then when the work gets created, then they are participants in it, but not performers. It's a very interesting, it's like the unconscious actor, the unconscious performer is very much part of how we see that relationship with audience. But having design and sound performance, the director, we very rarely work with writers. In fact, we usually, it's all co-devising. And because we're working from an immersive and participatory point of view, the dramaturgy and the kind of structure of the piece is really, really important. And we kind of all grow together. And part of it is also about constantly experiencing how that participant feels the work. Because what I'm really fascinated by is how the audience becomes part of the dramaturgy, how they shift it, how they push it, how the artistic intention as a framework is there, but how the audience can then create what they want to, or what sort of, or move the walls as much as they can within that framework. It was, when you talk about How High the Sky, that was a real turning point for us. Partly because there's so little baby work around, and this was for pre-walking babies. And I saw you had Anna Triglowan on one of your conversations during this period as well. So, and she was the designer on this. And this was a kind of a collaboration between me, Jess Wilson, and Anna Triglowan, and it was a trio of us working on it. Also brilliant creative team behind it as well. But the idea of working with babies kind of turned our theatrical knowledge on our heads, really. We had to really look at a completely different viewpoint, a completely different way to relate to an audience. We had to look really strongly at the relationship between the adult and the child because they couldn't exist without each other in that space. And we've also had to really examine our desire for narrative and what narrative meant. And that was about creating a world that had real dramaturgical shift and change and going to some very dark places as well. We weren't scared of dark because the babies weren't scared of dark. We weren't scared of popping balloons. We had these massive big balloons, helium-filled balloons that basically were the space. And they weren't scared of that either, so we had to readjust our ideas. And then we... And so we created a kind of it was like an environmental story, something that was felt within your body. It was completely visceral, it was completely emotional. And we just realized that the adult desire for meaning was the only thing we were struggling with. The baby's absorption rate and their acceptance of the world is entirely Buddhist. It was like they were the uncarved block and they were just sucking it in like a sponge. And the adult was the one who was going, I don't know what's going on. This is terrifying. What am I going to do? A balloon popped. So it was like we had to kind of take care of the adult in the space. And the only way we could do it, because we didn't want text in there. We tried text. We tried all sorts of things. But we didn't. We eventually ended up passing them a note that just said, can you see these things the way your baby does? And so that was a chance for the adult, and we could see them visibly relax at that point, and they just went, oh. So they started watching their child. They started looking at where the child was looking. Then they started looking for themselves. And so we had this beautiful separation. And one moment when we actually asked the adults to actually leave the space and leave the babies alone in the space, and everybody just looked at the babies. And that was a really, really profound moment, especially for young parents who were just there going with like tears. But seeing that little community of children as individuals for the first time. They're so close to you, and when you have your baby, you can't see them for who they really are. So for us, it made the biggest meaning of that work was about going, the child is a person now. This is what they do. This is where you didn't expect that. You didn't expect that. This is what they can do now. This is them now. So it was a really big, and it was a really big kind of examination of what theatre was. Because was this theatre? Was it a play space? Was it was it just because the child was fascinated by the light boxes and just stayed there the whole time and didn't see this beautiful piece of dance that Michelle Heaven was doing? Does that make it any less of an experience for that child? So we had to really examine what theatre was at that point. And for our watching audience, they had an instruction to regard the situation as if they were a bird watcher. They had to be like they were hiding in the bushes, and they had to be so quiet and not let anybody know they were there. And that was a really different role for that audience to play. And they felt very privileged to be there as well. Anyway, there were so many discoveries, but it also pushed us really strongly down this path of relationship between the adult and the child in the audience. And that's where we've gone ever since, of just really going to like Separation Street. We actually pulled them apart and had kids do one thing and adults do another in the same play, and the adults never found out what the children did. That was a bit distressing for some parents, but
there's something extraordinary about that, like the fact that children have such richly realized lives and worlds that are separate of the adults in them, that are so dominant in their lives. I find that really heartening that there's work being made that acknowledges that and, supports and uplifts that. Because it, like you said, it's children are people, which seems like such a trite statement, but
I know, but see, so many people don't realise that. Yeah. One of the exercises I do with artists starting out in this form is to ask them to remember when they were 5, which is a very, very particular age, and to remember the kind of experiences they had as a 5-year-old, not only just the joyous and happy ones, but the really nasty ones as well, the dangerous ones, because people don't realise that children have been through a lot already, and we forget that, and we believe that they're not capable of understanding or being in the space where difficult things are happening, whereas most children have. You ask anybody and scratch the surface and they will have had a turning point or a spiky event that they've never forgotten, and it's happened when they were very little. And this is not about re-traumatizing anybody or putting children through horrible experiences in the theatre, but it's just an acknowledgement, as you say, there's a people. They are people. They come out, and the babies taught us that too. They come out with their own personality and their own desire lines, and they follow those desire lines if they're allowed.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your work, I guess, teaching and mentoring and talking about these principles that you've discovered through the course of making these works. What do you find fulfilling about that, about mentoring other artists, about being able to share your process, you know, at conferences and in keynotes?
Well, I think it's just that sense of every time that we can talk about this or explore or do workshops about this idea of children being capable and having capacity and being able to be leaders and being able to be powerful, that kind of opens a crack for me into working towards this, you know, very aspirational vision. But it's such a joyous thing to see people going, oh, I've never really thought about doing that, or oh gosh, that sounds dangerous. Or part of it's about recognizing that the artist that we grow up to be, with all our training and with all our, you know, conviction of what we believe and what we think is right, that can be completely overturned in a flash when you start working with kids. And I love seeing that. Some people cope and some people don't. And so you have people involved in a situation where they are literally improvising and following whatever that child is offering within a space. Some people swim like dolphins in that sea, and some people start to drown. And then you know that, okay, we need either this is not the work for them, or we need to work a little harder on how to kind of manage that sense of uncontrol. And as an adult, we're looking for control over our identity, and we're looking for pattern and meaning and frameworks more and more and more. And this is why I love being able to explore with people the possibility of turning that upside down, and that losing control is a great opportunity. And the idea of losing control means that things are possible. And I think certainly in terms of what we're facing now, where restrictions are just battening down the hatches everywhere, and we're looking at our art forms being challenged to the point where we don't have audiences and we have to rehearse in masks and we can't have that shared experience. The knowledge then that the possibilities are endless has to be part of that resilience for the arts community as well. And that, you know, being able to share that with people, or be going, just try it. You know, one of the simple exercises I ask people to do is, if they have any children in their lives, is sit in a car with them, especially if they're of a certain age, like sort of anywhere between 5 and 7, 5 and 8. Ask the child to choose the way home if you're driving, and just go with it. And you can feel the resistance in you as an adult. You're going, that's not the right way. That's not the right way. That's not, we're never going to get home. And you can feel all the pressures of time and, you know, dinner's on the table or whatever it is. And yet that simple suggestion could take you a path that you've never been before. So, you know, it sounds a bit kind of hackneyed, that metaphor, but it's actually, that's all it literally is a path that you haven't explored.
It's something that, yeah, I guess I've worked a lot with young people, like all through kind of university. Everyone had part-time jobs in cafes and at shops, and I worked in after-school care. And the way I think that kids can, provide a different way into looking at the world is really fascinating. Because I think the thing that I find is fascinating is that we all had that. We just learnt and internalized other ways that were more efficient, or the right way, or, you know, a better way in our view, which I think is, really fascinating.
Well, that brings me to education, because that's the thing. Our education system has not got arts embedded in it. The national curriculum needs arts at the centre of it, because otherwise we are all going to what's right and correct. We're an assessment-based, we're in an accountable education system, whereas it's not about exploration. And this is a really big problem all around the world at the moment as well, because the arts programs are all being ripped out because nobody's got any money anymore. So the first thing to go is the arts. This just happened in the UK. They've lost all the arts practice in their curriculum. So as ASITEJ, we're getting together to go, what can we do about this? Because arts and education is an incredibly important part to provide that possibility, to provide the imagination that's necessary to even exist in this society. Look at me, I'm on my soapbox now.
You've got the right audience. I'm in total agreement.
But, that thing of this is the first thing we struggle with in process with children is this idea of I can't. And we do it with when we do professional developments as well. But the idea that I'm not creative or I can't or you're going to judge me is built into a child's expectation. Now, children as old as 5 are scared to draw because they don't feel they're going to get it right. And this is the problem with even our primary schools are testing children at grade 1. That is so bad. If someone's going, I'm going to fail a test if I do it any way except that way, then that's a real problem. Because if you're growing up with a whole population who thinks they're not creative, you can see how that's going to roll out. It's not good.
No, not at all. And yeah, it is one of those things where, I just think about the fact that I feel like a lot of adults don't think about play as being a right that children have, which they do. And the amount of scope I think that arts gives children for play to create those worlds that they do if you leave them alone for a bit. Yeah, and so it's, like I was saying earlier, just really exciting to hear about some of these works.
And play, is so important, isn't it? This is where people who go into disaster areas, the Red Cross were talking about it, they go into disaster areas and they look at what the children are doing. And if the children are playing, whether it's amidst the rubble or the flood or whatever, if they're playing, then the community has some resilience and there's some hope. Because if the children can find the space to play, then they are then they're still part of that world. And that it's a really fascinating study, actually. I forget where I saw it, but it's an intrinsic part of life, and we need to provide more opportunities. Absolutely.
So, you spoke a little bit about working in Indonesia. I wanted to ask you about working in Japan as well, because Polyglot has worked a lot kind of overseas and in the Asia Pacific region. What was that like? And speaking of disasters as well. Well,
yeah, that was, and it still is. We've had to put that process on hold for the last 2 years, sadly, but we're planning to go back next year. This year is the anniversary of the tsunami in 2011, and we went as part of the Australian Embassy project. That was called the Australia Market, and the Australia Embassy set up a whole bunch of stalls and gave away food, and they had performers there from Australia. And Polyglot went over at that stage with 3 of our Australian animal puppets, and then we went back 2 years later with We Built This City. And we performed it for the community, and we did a whole bunch of beautiful workshops around making your own house, because none of the children had any houses at that point. People were living in temporary accommodation that only just got out of the big schools where they were housing thousands of people, and the town was basically flattened at that point. And so we've gone back every 2 years to do a project, and in collaboration with local Japanese companies too. So we worked with 2 performers from Theatre Gumbo in Osaka in the first year, and then with Achikochi, which is a music organisation in Yokohama, and they've become our stable collaborators for the last 3 times we've gone. In fact, we're talking to Makako at the moment about how to make a video letter together to send to the community this year in recognition of the anniversary. It's so fascinating because the education system there is completely different to ours. They rotate teachers and principals every 3 to 5 years. So we'll be going back to a town that has no living memory of us in a way, and a town that's now been built 7 metres higher than it was. we've seen this whole thing unroll. It's been the most extraordinary relationship with Minami Senriku, and extraordinary for our artists as well, to work with those kids, to be part of that community's courage and bravery as they've recovered from something that was so devastating, and to hear the stories and the personal stories there as well. It's been extraordinary. I mean, it's one of the great things that happens at Polyglot, but it happens with a lot of theatre companies that work for children as well, is that the breadth of work that you get to do is just extraordinary. Like you might be running a workshop in a First Nations community one day, and then you'll be performing in the Lincoln Centre the next. You'll be, touring to South Korea one day and then going to Wagga Wagga the next. There's an extraordinary breadth of work and an extraordinary breadth of form. And so having all those skills and all those tools in our hands, that we can respond really beautifully to communities, and we can look at that functional part of art and go, what do people need here? Oh, they need a radio station. Let's do that. So those sorts of ways that your art and your theatre training and your desire to tell stories can be fleshed out in so many different ways. So those intercultural collaborations, and I would say that the First Nations intercultural collaborations that we've had have been the most significant for our company. And there's a whole lot we could say about our various governments' lack of respect for the incredible culture of this country, and what we could do if we turned that around. Australia would be extraordinary. But yeah, those sorts of significant relationships are the life changes in your career as an artist, I believe. It's not about the next gig. It's not about, fame and fortune in the end. It's about the work that you do and the change that you make.
Very much so. It's it is one of those really interesting things, because I think a lot of people, maybe early on in our careers as artists, we think about things quite linearly, in terms of, if I do this, then I can do that later, and that might lead to this. But no artist I know who's been practicing, who has a practice as a professional artist, has had a linear path, or even thought about themselves outside of their work in that way, of like, I'm looking for this to take me to that, which I think is a really reassuring, and is really, again, heartening, because there are so many different ways to practice what it is that we all love doing.
Yeah.
For you, I guess, what are the differences that you've seen in this sector since you started at Polyglot in 2000 and now?
Gosh, so that's 21 years, folks. Look, I mean, the sad part of it is that it has the funding and the support around this sector has diminished massively. In 2015, when Brandis defunded the Australia Council, it had a huge impact. And there used to be 21 funded youth arts companies in Australia, and now there's literally, 5 youth arts companies. And in terms of federally funded children's theatre companies, there are only 3 in the whole country. So there's a perception there that is really significant across the last, only 6 years. That was pretty rapid. And so that I think has had a massive effect. It's also had a massive effect that in Australia Council, the youth arts stream, or the young people's theatre stream, was taken away, so there was no specific focus. That is something that we would have loved to have back, because that specific focus, it's like addressing any marginalisation. It needs to be there so that population is served. Otherwise they get missed all the time. We get put under the radar all the time. And I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is around that sense of value. because arts has been taken out of education, because all of the kind of everything that we touch has to do with the whole of society. It's not just about putting a piece of theatre on in a theatre. We have, we're working with children, so we're engaging with early years care, with childcare, with primary schools, with high schools, with youth arts companies, with community groups, with sporting clubs. The whole thing are places we touch. And so that means that this whole sector, if all those and welfare, health and services, mental health services for children, all of those things, if arts is taken out of that stuff, then that means that the sense of what we do is greatly diminished across the population. So, okay, that's the downside. The upside is that I think that people are becoming more explorative, that there's more willingness to take risks in this sector, that there's more people who've come through it, who are now in leadership positions, who are going, what about the kids? I love it every time some artist has a child and goes, where's the children's theatre? As if it's just like a new thing. And bless you all, come along for the ride. And I love moments like this where I'm invited to talk to a major tertiary institution to go, think about this as a career. This is important. Not important, it is intensely satisfying. And so the more people that are out there talking it up, I think that's got better. We're getting better at personal advocacy, and we're getting better at sticking together as well. I would say because of the huge kind of cuts and everything, and because of the pandemic, the gift of the virus is that we've become much better friends.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some definite upsides, even though the downsides are immense and ongoing. There are certainly some silver linings to it. Looking to the future, what excites you? What are you excited by thinking about where we could be moving forward?
Well, I think what I just last mentioned, like the gift of the virus has been connection. Even though we've not been able to share physical space, even though our sense of identity as artists sometimes feels like it's been completely eradicated. There was a moment in lockdown last year where I was going, what is my purpose? Why am I here? Like all the big existential questions. But I feel that connection and real conversation is a really great way forward, and that we, because of our connection and friendship and people exchanging more, having an easier format to exchange, having an easier format to quickly have discussions, being a bigger part of webinars, of seminars all over the world. We have a stronger sense of everybody else's struggle and what everyone else is dealing with as well. And I do feel that one of the bright moments for me is that people have more tools now to be those advocates for the arts, and also more capacity to think outside their own career path. And I feel that certainly during the lockdowns for us in Melbourne, there was a lot of invisible art happening, and people just doing it because they really wanted to do it. Musicians who were my partner ran this project in aged care centres where musicians just came and played out of the love of their hearts, and that has turned into a major project which has got funding and blah blah blah. So that idea that we can do it, even if we can't, that gets things happening. And I think everybody's had a greater sense now that once you put that first step down, then things start to happen. And that we can't give up. We just can't. There's too much at stake. And in a way that's it. We've kind of discovered our grit. We've discovered how lucky we are compared to a lot of the world. And that's something we can't forget as well. We are very lucky. However, that doesn't mean that we lie down in front of our politicians and say, don't worry, just take it all. Because arts is very, very important.
Absolutely. Sue, thank you so much for joining me for this chat this afternoon. It's been excellent getting to hear about your work. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
Take care, you folks.